Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another, and sometimes we have a laughing fit before we start recording.
Sometimes, yeah.
We've recovered, I think. Aaron, my friend, you're up this week.
Yeah.
What have you brought to the table today?
I'm bringing a report from GenForward, G-E-N, like Generation Forward.
Yes.
And the movement for Black Lives. The report is called Perspectives on Community Safety from Black America. This is a report that shares the results of a survey that these two groups organized together so they could measure, quote, Black people's experiences with policing and incarceration and their feelings about alternatives to these systems. And it's really, really in depth.
Yes.
And points out the way that organizers can frame the work that they're doing to defund and abolish the police as common sense reforms to the prison industrial complex. And these would be ways that are actually reducing the power, influence, and reach of the prison industrial complex that have a lot of support, as it turns out.
Absolutely.
So I already quoted the executive summary of this report when I introduced this at the end of last week's episode. So I'm going to do that again, but with a different part.
Okay.
Because there was a lot of good stuff in that executive summary. So they said, quote, our study found that support for transforming policing and incarceration is strongest when alternatives are specified. We found low support overall when asking about defunding or abolishing the police, with young adults expressing more support and older adults expressing less support. However, when we explicitly asked about alternative non-policing solutions to public safety, we found consistently large majorities of Black people in support, even when we paired such alternatives with divestment from policing. So while the answer to all of this is ultimately abolishing the police, it's better to talk about what we're going to replace the police with than to talk about how they won't exist anymore. Which makes a lot of sense when you think about how ingrained the police and prisons are in our own collective concepts of public safety.
Yes.
And we can't just shut down the police and prisons tomorrow, you know, even if we wanted to.
Even if we wanted to.
And we won't, but that might be how it sounds to people when we talk about defund and we talk about abolition.
Right.
So this was a great report that dived into different ways that you can present the ultimate project of abolition to people in a way that they would respond to positively. Mm-hmm. You know, it's important to give people a vision of where we're going instead of just saying, well, let's defund. So yeah, let's get into this. What did you think? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I know I said this to you last week when you introed this, but this was a really great report. I was so looking forward to you bringing it to the podcast. It, to me, was so thorough and insightful in this survey and analysis around such an important topic. Like you said, I think about how we present the topic of abolition to folks and how we sometimes have to bring folks along in that. And so this is a way to do that. And, to do this critically important work that I think is important for us to meet the collective safety needs of particularly Black people in this country, because that's what this report is all about. And it's all about, I think, centering Black folks in the work, which is also important. So this survey, which I think they mentioned at one point, it was a nationally representative sample of Black people across the country were given this survey. Mm-hmm. The survey itself provided, I think, some great data to help inform how we can best go about transforming policing and the criminal punishment system and ultimately abolishing it. But doing so with the understanding and support and input and perspectives of Black people informing this work. So yeah, this was great. I would encourage folks to check it out. One of the things that I wanted to talk about and I thought might be a good place for us to start was the invest, divest approach to public safety that this report discusses early on.
Yes.
The approach itself came from the 2016 policy blueprint called Vision for Black Lives, which was created by the Movement for Black Lives org. And it featured these 6 demands for reimagining public safety that call for an investment in things like education, healthcare, true public safety measures for Black people, as well as a divestment in police and prisons and fossil fuels and all of the tentacles of the criminal punishment system. And one of the things I think this report does a really great job in is highlighting the impacts of that approach over the years. Yeah. So we, a few years back had the Breathe Act and other federal bills that were inspired by it. We saw cities like Milwaukee and Oakland reallocate their funding from policing to true public safety measures, which was awesome. Great victories. We saw organizing campaigns that drew attention to things like how inhumane the criminal punishment system is and all of the systemic issues that are terrorizing Black people in America. And so in so many ways, I think the highlight that this invest, divest approach is one that actually resonates with Black people. Like they highlight that it resonates. It makes sense when you talk about it in that way. It helps folks make sense of the urgency behind this work and the need to move beyond policing and the criminal punishment system as it exists, and instead invest in and implement community-oriented safety measures that really are all about the people that they're here to serve. So that to me felt like such good context setting, like early on in the report for everything that they talk about. And yeah, it just makes sense to me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that whole Visions for Black Lives platform that they released is really, really great and a great thing to look into if you haven't seen that before. So at one point they start discussing the views on defunding the police and police alternatives, and found that how we talk about, as I mentioned earlier, how we talk about defund and abolition really matters.
Yes.
The report says, quote, support for these proposals are strongest among younger generations. And they're talking about defund and abolition there. But 50% of Gen Z and 42% of millennials support defunding the police, and 27% and 24% support abolishing the police, respectively. While our survey data show that a subset of Black people in the U.S., primarily younger generations, support defunding and abolishing police, many do not. This may be due to a variety of reasons. Some could be concerned about the potential consequences of defunding, such as an increase in crime rates or slower response times. We can speculate that support may be low due to how normalized policing is for solving crimes and, quote, keeping us safe as we build concrete alternatives. Some may not know what the alternatives to traditional policing are, which contributes to skepticism.
Yes.
So that's a great insight into what the report found, what the survey found. But if they mention specific alternatives like taking money from police budgets to create a new agency that would specialize in de-escalation and mental health crisis intervention, that had support from 86% of respondents.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is huge. Like that's basically consensus in my mind. If that was a result in an election in the United States, we would look into it as being suspicious.
Yes.
86% of people are like, well, yeah, maybe they don't need all that money, and we can give them to do this thing that doesn't interrupt or that doesn't bring somebody to your door to respond to a mental health crisis or something else who is armed with a weapon.
Yes.
And so I think that that's a really great example of how if we say like we're going to take a chunk out of this huge budget that is in most large cities 50% of the municipal budget,
right?
And we're going to take it and we're put it in this agency over here that will specialize in de-escalation and response to crisis, and maybe some conflict management too for people who need that. But people are on board with that.
People are on board with that, and it makes sense to them. And to me, I love that you brought that up, because to me, so much of what all of that connects to what I mentioned about the invest, divest framework as well. And so it's another reason why I think having this data is so great. Having this data about what Black people are thinking and feeling about these concepts, the notion of defunding the police and policing alternatives, is just a great framework. It's great context to have in developing this blueprint for how we best continue to gain support for all of these alternatives to policing that we need.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So to me, that was great. That was such a great takeaway from this report. I highlighted that. Another key takeaway that I think was from that same section is something that we've talked about before, and that's just how the notion of policing is baked into the fabric of this country. And you mentioned at the top, ingrained in how we think about society. It's just a part of our society. It's been that way since the beginning of time.
Right.
There was this great analysis of all of this in the report that I wanted to share. So they say, quote, "The state has built a system in which the main instrument for producing safety and safe communities is through policing. Thus, if Black people in the U.S. want safety for their families and communities, they are often forced to rely on police, hoping they can have confidence in them. Our findings underscore the unfortunate reality that is these hopes and needs are frequently met with ineffectiveness, harassment, and violence. And I think so much of the data that they collected in this survey also shows how Black people are concerned about the intensity and severity and impact of that ineffectiveness and violence and in our lives and in our communities as well, which is a huge part of this too. And so all of that to me is a worthy justification of the work that needs to be done as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mentioned this in the other quote that I had from the executive summary, where the amount of people who had negative experiences and negative perceptions of the police who were surveyed was huge.
Yes.
But a lot of those folks still supported the police because that's the only thing that we know.
Yes.
And so, it's again another, if you show people where we can go, what we can do beyond what we know currently, they get on board.
Yeah, and that doesn't produce the same levels of violence and really inflicts the same level of violence that the current system does. Absolutely.
Yeah. So another element that was in the report is they asked some specific questions about different parts of police reforms that exist as ideas. And one was police in schools.
Right.
So the report says, quote, in the domain of education, 64% said they supported replacing police in schools with social workers and counselors. So I think this makes a lot of sense when you see the videos that have gone viral of police in schools handcuffing young Black kids or throwing a young Black girl to the ground.
Oh, yes.
And connecting that with another part of this report that highlights that police violence negatively impacts Black mental health. Beyond the people who are individually experiencing it, there's a community impact that's bigger than the folks who are immediately involved. So the report goes on to say that, quote, research has indicated that police officers in schools, often called school resource officers, SROs, contribute to criminalizing students of color through over-policing and extreme disciplinary action. So again, here's an element of policing that people are aware of because they've seen their kids or members of their community experience policing in schools, and they've seen news reports of that policing in schools. We've seen viral video of that policing in schools. So the common sense response is that maybe we don't need this thing.
Yes.
And a lot of these people can also remember when we didn't have police in schools as prevalently as we do now, because it's not
I remember that time.
that long ago.
Right.
So, you present them with this idea and it's like, yeah, maybe we don't need to have fully armed police walking the halls of our schools when we could spend that money on social workers and counselors who would respond to crises in a more effective way while being unarmed.
Right.
For all of our students. And so I just appreciated that element of this too, where they explored, what are your thoughts on this and how is this impacting your community and what do you think we can do instead? And again, it's another way to present the invest, divest framework of this is how we're currently spending money. We could divest it from here and invest it in this other thing.
Yes. And I love what you say about social workers and counselors, having them in school to address and deal with and respond to crises that are taking place. But those folks also exist in the day-to-day when there's no crisis, and they're just there as people for students to look up to, or children to look up to and get support from and advice from and learn from, right? And so I think the day-to-day benefit of having those folks in our schools fully outweighs the any benefit that having an SRO in our school would have.
Right, because that mentorship comes from a different place.
Yes.
And that's another layer of staff members who can connect with students and serve as, you said, role models and mentoring students and pushing them toward some whatever success looks like to that student.
Yeah. I think the other thing that this section makes me think about, and what you said makes me think about, is not only is our police in schools and it's contributing to poor mental health of folks there, and we've seen the videos of what police have done in school, it's also a connection to the school to prison pipeline. And we've talked about that here on the show as well. And what our schools that are supposed to be these safe spaces for learning become as a result of this, I think is so unfortunate. And another way to, again, bring folks along and thinking about what could be.
Yeah, and I meant it. I've mentioned that I've read Punished for Dreaming recently. There's a whole chapter in there about the school to prison pipeline and the way that that has been an education reform over the last few decades.
Yes.
And there's an individual story of a kid who got arrested in school, and he goes to jail that day, and he was like, "This wasn't that different than school." To me, like the order, having to stand in line, having to be checked through security, like all of those pieces, it was a different way.
It was familiar.
It was school in a different setting,
Yes.
really, to him. And so there was a lot of familiarity in that experience that he had that
That's
day.
powerful.
Yeah.
That's powerful and telling. Absolutely. Well, so I appreciate you bringing that up. One of the other things that stood out to me as something that I appreciated was the survey data around reforms to contemporary policing practices and incarceration in general.
Yep.
And there were much smaller age differences for these types of reforms. So to me, that indicated an avenue to pursue, something to be moved on potentially more immediately. If you've got a broader scale of support or range of support, like this is the way to go. The report says, quote, a large majority of respondents, 82%, said they strongly or somewhat supported increasing federal funding for states to develop crisis response systems that do not rely on incarceration. The vast majority, 88%, also expressed support for hiring mental health professionals as non-police first responders to de-escalate mental health crises. There is substantial support, 88%, for the initiation of violence interruption initiatives like ceasefire programs, which aim to promote firearm safety and violence prevention by providing outreach and support services to gangs, groups, and individuals who are at high risk of shooting or being shot. So, again, I think that this is telling data that would be a great place to hone some of the work that organizers are doing around advocating for creating and implementing these alternatives and alternatives to our criminal punishment system and public safety, since it has such a large swath of support from Black people of all ages. And I think, all of this data to me is so connected. This connects exactly to what you just talked about in our schools. But to me, I wanted to highlight that as an idea that I had around this being a great place to potentially target some of the work that we're doing.
Yes. And I think again, the numbers they're so huge. It's like, how is this not something that we can try out, pursue, and look into implementing?
And if we can get that done, what else can we do?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
All right, let's shift here. Let's talk about some application. How does this report apply to our day-to-day lives?
Okay.
I think there's a lot of ways we could take this report and apply it to our lives, whether that's here on the podcast or in the way that we talk about abolition to random people on the street, as we are known to do.
Yes.
This report gives really, really strong evidence of how we frame alternatives to policing and prison, and how that matters, and how there is a lot of strong support for those alternatives.
Absolutely.
And so the report goes on to say, quote, the concept of investing in community resources and adopting alternative solutions has resonated more deeply than the use of terms such as defund and abolish. This finding should shape our future narratives and advocacy efforts. Organizers advocating for police alternatives and reform should take into account how these communication strategies have resonated with Black people in the U.S. And so there's a lot in that. I think that one of the lessons is that maybe defund has been completely, not completely, but has been hijacked in some ways by mainstream media and right-wing media as something that is inherently radical, which in some ways it is, but there are other ways for us to be able to communicate about it. And so this makes me think of the chart from Critical Resistance, where they break down the difference between reformist reforms, which are reforms that don't do much to change the structure of policing and prisons. So like a reformist reform example is body cameras on police, because they just figure out how to turn them off, or the police departments withhold the footage, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't change the ultimate structure of police and prisons. It doesn't change the amount of power that they have. And ultimately, it gives them more power because it gives them more money in their budgets to be able to pay for and maintain the body cameras. Reformist reform. And abolitionist reform, which are reforms that reduce the power and influence of police and prisons, which would be like reducing the size of your officer force and hiring people who would be mental health crisis responders with the money that you are saving from the officers that you used to employ on the city payroll. So yeah, this made me think of the critical resistance chart and what are the ways that we can talk about the things on that chart in the context of the results they found here.
Absolutely. Well, my goodness, I have to say you continue to win application here. It helps when you go first.
Yeah,
I think, right? I might have something great to say, but I go second. No, I think that's hands down the application of this report. How we frame this work, how we get support from and buy-in from the community in doing it is so important. I think that's a big piece of what this report is trying to communicate or, help us understand. The other thing the report said I wanted to highlight that's, I think, connected to what you just shared is this, quote, "The data make one thing abundantly clear. Black people want alternatives to policing for community safety. The call from the community to divest from this system and reinvest in sustainable alternatives is loud and clear. There is a strong desire for approaches that emphasize prevention, restorative justice, and support for those formerly incarcerated, rather than the continued construction of prisons and increased police presence. The system must include resources that acknowledge and address the underlying issues of poverty, racism, mental health, and education. Investing in prevention through community-based initiatives such as social programming, job training, mentorship programs for youth, housing security, and nutrition can go a long way toward addressing these issues." Yeah, that, to me, all of what we just shared there is the application of this.
Absolutely.
And what we need to do. Yeah.
Yeah. A great application. Let's move on to homework. So what are we going to do to continue learning about this beyond our conversation today? As always, in reports like this, there are tons of references and footnotes that are all great homework. A couple stood out to me. One is another report called Mass Incarceration Trends from the Sentencing Project. They're an organization dedicated to ending mass incarceration. The report goes over prison growth, probation and parole, federal drug laws, voting rights, youth, and a lot more.
Wow.
Another resource that's shared is something called Police Violence Report, which is a project from Mapping Police Violence. The report that shows up when you visit their website is data from 2023, but you can see previous years on their site as well. And it breaks down like how many people were killed by police, how they were killed, where it happened, what the victims were alleged to have been doing when police killed them, what kind of incident the police were responding to, and a lot more. So there's a lot of great just insight to learn about who is being killed and sort of why on that site. So a couple really great resources to continue to look into.
Really great resources. Absolutely. Definitely could be things that we could also bring to the table at some point this year. I love that. So I'll co-sign that. I think for me, I'd love to learn a little bit more about GenForward, right? So this was the first time I had heard of them, and I did a little bit of digging. They're based out of the University of Chicago, and they say this about themselves. The GenForward survey is the first of its kind, a nationally representative survey that pays special attention to how race and ethnicity shape how young adults, both millennials and Gen Zers, experience and think about the world. And so when I digged around a little bit, they've got some incredible data, information, and just lots of resources on their website from all of the work that they've conducted. So I think it would be great to poke around their website, see what else we can learn from them, because this survey and this data was really helpful in our continued learning work about all of this that we talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Sounds great. Yeah, I think learning more about GenForward sounds great because I don't know much about them.
Yeah. And always good to have, data behind anything that you're trying to do. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely. All right, great. Well, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring a feature from Nonprofit Quarterly called The Limits of Civil Disobedience by Kevin Golsorky. If I've gotten that wrong, I apologize. And it actually was just published a few days ago as we sit here and record this.
Well.
Yeah, so it's hot off the presses, the online web presses. So I'll be honest, I just found this piece. I've only read a few lines from it. I'm not 100% sure how we might feel about all of the arguments he makes in this piece, but, we'll see how it goes, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll have a decent conversation from it. So, tune in next week, folks, to find out how this goes. But I did pull a paragraph from it just because I think this paragraph sums up his major argument, but again, only a few lines. Quote, protesting grotesque moral violations is not easy, and protesters will often incur the public's wrath for disruptive acts. These acts of disobedience may not even bring the changes that would restore justice to the order of things. Nonetheless, they are important moral gestures, both in communicating a grievance and expressing public solidarity with the aggrieved. In emphasizing that without justice, there will be no peace, disruptive and uncivil disobedience threatens a political consensus that normalizes the silencing of the oppressed. So, yeah, we'll see what we can learn from this, and, we'll see how our conversation goes next week.
Yeah, it sounds really intriguing.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to reading it and learning some more right here.
Very good.
But with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. And you know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating, a review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And tell more people about Abolition, please. And thank you for listening. On the street. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.